Hi everyone, welcome to Supply Chain Management. So let me briefly introduce myself. So my name is Si Chen. I'm an assistant professor from the IMSE department. My research specialty is in supply chain management with focuses on sustainability and new smart mobility systems. So let's first go through the syllabus and tell you what this class is about, what the formats we're going to introduce in this class, and then you can ask any questions you have about this class. Alright, so top is the basic information of this class. You know where it is, you know when is the lecture. My office hours are scheduled at 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Tuesdays, but if you cannot make it to that time, feel free to shoot me an email and we'll schedule another time. And we have a grader. His name is Nikhil Jango. So he will be grading the homework assignments. And so if you have specific questions to the grading of the assignments, please direct to him. You can feel free to copy me in your correspondence. And the course description is the same as you see on the course website. So I'm not going to read it again to you. Program goals for MSc department is also available on the website. Our textbook is Supply Chain Management Strategy, Planning and Operation, 7th edition. This book is written by Chopra and Mindel, and just for reference, the cover looks like this. And I did tell the bookstore to order some, so you should be able to rent or buy from the bookstore. And of course, it's available in a lot of other sources, as you know. So the main platform of communication outside of the lectures is Canvas. I'll be posting the lecture notes, any supplemental materials that we're going to use in each lecture a day before the lecture presentation. Homework will be also posted on Canvas, so you'll submit the homework assignment, so your solution to the homework assignment online through file uploads, and then homework solution will also be posted on Canvas. So usually we'll have homework assignments regularly, and they will usually be due a week from the assignment's time. So and I'll make the homework assignment available the day after the lecture notes, to be fair to the distant learning students, because they won't be able to access it immediately. And so generally, late assignments are not accepted, but I understand things happen, so each person is allowed one late assignments up to 7 days. However, I do ask you to, if you need to be late in some assignments, do let me know ahead of time. Okay, so another part of this class that is perhaps different from a lot of the engineering classes here is we do have some interactive sessions, because what we're learning is supply chain management, and it's really difficult to understand supply chain management if you don't talk about the applications. So in these interactive sessions, we'll be looking at, you may be playing a game in a simulation, or you may form groups and discuss case studies. Alright, so we have 1 simulation session and 3 case study sessions. So for in-class students, these sessions are required for you to attend because they will be part of your grade. And I'll talk about the alternative options for distance learning students in just a little bit. And so for the simulation session, I will each interactive section will still start the preparation of it a week ahead of time. So for the simulation, there's not a lot of ahead of time preparation other than assigning a group and making sure you create your account to the online game. So, and I will provide the details later on in this course. For case studies, I will be posting the case study materials a week ahead of time. And so you'll be able to see the case descriptions and the case questions I posted related to the description. So for in-class students, we'll have a short discussion of the case at the beginning of the class, and then we'll break apart into group discussions. And this will be about 30-40 minutes in groups of up to 3 people. So, and as a group, you'll be preparing a 1-page summary of how you view the case, how do you answer the questions that's posted in the slides, and submit a summary of your discussion before we reconvene in this classroom. So, and then as a class, we'll start the discussion of the case, and each individual student will contribute by answering questions, and in this case, you will represent yourself. And so in the case study sessions, I will expect you to participate in the discussions very actively. So for each question, I recommend highly that you look at the case ahead of time and think about it ahead of time and raise your hands as often as possible. So as a rule of thumb, I would want to have you answer 1 question in each interactive session. And of course, your answer will be judged also based on the quality and the quantity. So, and then at the end of each discussion, you'll be given about 15-20 minutes to write a summary of reflection based on the discussion, and summarize whether your discussion with the rest of the class has changed your initial view, and if you have any additional takeaways. And for in-class students, there is no substitute for the class participation, and no extra credit will be offered to substitute these interactive session participations. And each student is allowed to miss 1 in-class discussion, provided that you let me know beforehand, because some of you work part-time, do internships, and I will take attendance at during each of these sessions. So for the grading of these interactive sessions, the whole interactive session participation accounts for 20% of your grade, and the 20% is decomposed to 10%, which is based on the summary you wrote as a group. And 5% is contribute to your individual responses in the class discussion. And then 5% is on the final reflection. Any questions about these interactive sessions? Okay, so for distant learning students, which I'm not sure any of you is distant learning students, but for distant learning students, you are not required to attend the discussion in real time or in person. However, it is an option. So instead of coming to class or participate online with the rest of the class, for a case study, you can do two things. So one is for instead of the group discussion input and in-class discussion, you can review the case study material ahead of time and answer the case questions posted on Canvas and submit your answers before 9 p.m. of the day of in-class discussion. And then for the reflection, this is to be submitted within 1 week after the in-class discussion, and therefore also before the next in-class lecture. So this is intended for you to submit after watching the in-class discussion lecture video. So for the simulation, because the simulation is done on an online platform, so it can be very easily adapted for distant learning students. And the default setting, so if you don't tell me any different preference, I would assume that you will pursue this default option. So in this case, you'll be forming groups with other distant learning students and figure out a time that is convenient for all of you to carry out the simulation. And I will be helping you to form these groups. And this should be done within 2 weeks of the in-class simulation. And so you're expected to, 1, complete the simulation, and I'll be able to see the result, and 2, submit a brief 1-page summary of your experience with the simulation. And other than that, you can also choose to play this simulation game with the rest of the class, either by coming to class in person or participate real time but through BlueJeans or Skype, any other online interface. So if you do choose this option, you will need to notify me by the Friday before the in-class session, because I will be needing to make the group assignments after that. And so for distant learning students, just make sure that you will notify me any of your preferences in the above choices by the Friday before each interactive session. And it's really important to note the dates for these interactive sessions. So simulation will be on the 29th of January. The first case study is the 26th, second case study 26th of February, and then second case study is 26th of March, and then last case study is on the last day of class. So, and any questions so far? So, other than that, we'll have one exam in this class, which is going to be during the finals week. According to our the university assigned time, the final will be taking place from 6:30 to 8:30 on April 23rd. So the exam will be closed book. However, you will be allowed 2 pages of standard US letter size cheat sheet, and on which you can write anything. You can handwrite or you can type. Alright, so the grading decomposition, homework will be 20% homework will be 40%, and the discussion participation, which refers to these interactive sessions, will count for 20% of the grade, and these are the further decompositions. And the final exam will be 40%. So this schedule lists the tentative schedules of lecture topics. We may deviate from the topics a little bit for the regular lectures. However, the interactive sessions will follow strictly with this schedule. So, and then the references. So these are the references that you can refer to if you want to learn more about supply chain management. So some of these are books, and some are related to papers, and these are also some additional resources for you to look at. These are the most popular magazines and journals related to the field of supply chain management. And finally, please make sure you read through the university policies. Okay, questions? Nope, all on board? Okay, good. So also, other than that, I do want to learn a little bit about you. So I have started a discussion board on Canvas, and please take some time to very briefly introduce yourself, about any background you have, any work you have done related to supply chain management or not related to supply chain management. Why are you interested in this course, and anything else that you would like us to know. Alright, so in each class we'll lecture for about an hour or so, and then have 15 minutes or so break, and then come back to finish the rest of the class. Alright, so first topic of this class is understanding what is supply chain, what are the most important issues of the supply chain, and why is it important to understand it. So in this part, we're going to look at what is the objective of supply chain management and why is it important to make these decisions, and what are the key supply chain decisions and what are their significance. Then we'll describe a couple different views of supply chain and how do we categorize supply chains based on the cycle view or push or pull view, and what are the macro processes within the supply chain. And then we'll briefly look at what are the important issues and decisions that we'll be facing when you are managing a supply chain. And finally, what we're focusing on in this course. Okay, so first of all, what is supply chain? Now, these are a lot of words, but can you summarize in your mind very briefly what do you think supply chain is? Yes.
Moving goods and services from one person to the customer, like from the beginning to the end.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So you mentioned we're moving goods, right? So the one objective of the supply chain is to move products. And it covers everybody from the beginning to the end. The end being the customers, and the beginning being maybe raw material suppliers, right? So important thing is in a supply chain, we do consider all the parties involved, either directly or indirectly. So we have these kind of nodes of supply chain, including, maybe a supplier, going to a manufacturer, going to a retailer, and going to final customers. And also the links in between, right? Each is covered by some transportation or logistics service. And other than products, what's moving in a supply chain also includes information, also includes cash. And other than the name supply chain, people sometimes call it supply network or supply web, which perhaps are more accurate phrases because the structure of a supply chain can be very complicated. But supply chain is the most commonly used word. And so typically supply chains have stages such as customers, retailers, so wholesalers, distributors, manufacturers, and suppliers, and different tiers of suppliers. And so this is just one example of how one supply chain might look like. And this is perhaps a very common supply chain shape. So in the beginning, we have what's so-called an assembly process, where we're combining components into final products. And then when it converges to an assembly plant, and you can see this is automotive supply chain, it will then go through this distribution process from the assembly plant to dealers and then to the final customers. So we know that there are information, product, and fund flows in the supply chain. So in which direction does product flow?
Towards customer.
Towards customer. and both. In which time does it flow back?
And there is a defect with the product.
When there are
Returns,
defects and
service,
returns,
returns.
right? And sometimes recycle. Good. And in terms of cash flows, in which direction does cash flow? Upstream, from customer to dealer to retailer to suppliers. What about information flows? Both ways, and you can go all directions. So, and the management of this flow is very important and the key of supply chain management. So looking at one example supply chain, so this is, say, a supply chain for detergent at Walmart. So we're using Walmart as the focal company here, right? So Walmart sources this product from Procter & Gamble or other manufacturers, depending the selection of detergent that Walmart carries. So, and this P&G and these manufacturers may again source the components of these detergents from different suppliers. So it may source the chemical part from a chemical company, and it may source the packaging materials from a packaging supplier. And then, so Walmart could use their own warehouse or use a third-party distribution center to store these detergents, and then which will then be transported to Walmart stores, and in which customers like us will go to buy detergents. So in this, what are some common cycles of production, information, and cash flows? So we know that the cash flows upstream. So as customers, we come to Walmart stores and give Walmart cash in exchange to the detergents, and so on and so forth. And then the product, right? So first the product will flow from, the supplier to P&G and to the central warehouse or distribution center to the Walmart store, and then go to customers' homes. And sometimes customers may not like the product and decide to return the product back to the Walmart store, and sometimes Walmart can return or recycle part of the product to P&G or the third-party warehouse, so creating another reverse product flow. So the appropriate design of the supply chain will depend on what the customer needs. So, for example, in Dell supply chain, the computer hardware company Dell, so it has two structures for its supply chain. One is it produces really large servers and sell it to companies. And it also produces personal computers and sell to customers like us. And so for servers, they have a supply chain that's directly going from Dell to the customers without these third-party logistics or without retail stores. For the personal computers, however, Dell go through their website, their distribution centers, and to retail stores like Walmart, like Best Buy. Right, so why is there such a difference?
Cost. The costs are different.
Requirement, customer requirement.
Customer requirements are different. In what sense?
Demand is different. Demand is less for servers and it's high for personal computers.
Okay. So demand is different in what way? Yes.
With some of the servers, you gotta personalize it to like, specific to what they need. So it's more in customer value.
Right.
Like, you don't wanna give them something they don't want or too
Mhm.
much.
Mm-hmm. Right. Really, that's a very good point. So in fact, Dell used to have a direct supply chain structure for personal computers also. And it was one of the reasons Dell was so successful in the early years, because back then standardized computers could not satisfy customer demand. So then they had customized computers, personal computers, until in 2007, I believe, that the standardized computer models was sufficient to satisfy most end customer demand. So then they changed the supply chain structure to the going through third-party retailer structure. And this kind of trade-off is especially important in today's environment where we have, the transition or competition between brick and mortar stores and online sellers, right? So which model do you use, which channels do you go through are very important decisions. So, what is the objective of a supply chain? Now, if when we ask someone this question, a simple answer would be to make money, right? However, that is a proxy but not the actual goal of supply chain. So the actual objective of a supply chain is to generate the maximum supply chain surplus. So there's the supply chain surplus is different from supply chain profit. So surplus is the difference between customer value and the cost of the supply chain. Right, so for example, usually customer value is on certain thing, You and I have different preferences to almost any kind of product. So, we could be facing a group of customers with very different values with certain distributions. So let's say this is the probability of customer values. Right, so if I price my product at this point, then only customer with higher values will buy this product. And so the supply chain surplus is this customer value instead of what I sell the product for, so product price minus the supply chain cost. So for example, if I'm Best Buy, I'm selling an internet router, and I'm selling it for $60. So price is $60. And for a customer with valuation that is $80, this customer is going to buy this router, assuming no competition. And then maybe I have a cost of $40, right, to make or to order this router. then the supply chain surplus is equal to 80 minus 40 equals $40. But the profit is only 60 minus 40. Equals $20. Right, so if you're a profit maximizing company, of course you want to maximize your profits given the supply chain surplus, but that is impossible in virtually any scenario. But we'll see a strong positive correlation between supply chain surplus and the profits. So generally, if you maximize supply chain profitability, that is also the solution to maximize supply chain surplus. And so, it's important to note that supply chain profitability refers to the total profit of the supply chain rather than the profit of each individual companies in the supply chain. So, in a lot of times, there are conflicting goals between these companies. So, for a supply chain to have its best performance, one should look at supply chain as a whole rather than each company going for their own individual goal. So, having defined that the supply chain success is defined in terms of supply chain surplus, which is actually a combination between value of customers, the revenue, and the cost of the supply chain. So then we want to look at these important components: revenue, cost, and customer value. Where do they come from? First of all, for revenue, the only source of revenue is only customers. Right, so that's why customer preferences and understanding our customer needs is so key in managing a supply chain, because that determines revenue and determines our profitability. And the sources of cost then includes the cost of information, cost of producing products, and cost of transactions between different stages. And the value obtained by a customer, for example, imagine you're a customer looking at detergent at Walmart. Where do you think your valuation of the product comes from?
Comparing to other products.
The
Comparing to other similar products.
compared to other similar products. So you're talking about the functionality of the product?
No, like comparing the detergent with other producers' detergent. Like, what is the price of the other brands' detergent and how much they do?
Okay, so cost. So cost is an important factor, but we're talking about the source of valuation. So valuation of the product is the part that's not involving the actual money you spend on the product. Also, we're taking the perspective of Walmart. So for Walmart, we're not really competing against the different suppliers of different kinds of detergent. We're a channel to sell them, right? So we want to understand what's the value derived by customers by purchasing a detergent. for simplicity, you can just ignore competition right now. So going to Walmart, what do you think the values of Walmart cares about?
How much you spend and how often the customer returns.
How much it spends and how often the customer returns. Okay, so these are measures to judge your customer satisfaction, service level, and perhaps indication of how much value customer places on your product, right? So the internal product that Walmart provides to customer is not just the detergent, right? There are also other things that associate with this bottle of detergent. For example, its availability, its after-sales service, right? And the variety, for example, I provide in my store. So then these are the sources of customer valuation. And so these are important factors to consider, and in doing supply chain management, we manage these sources of cost, sources of revenue, and by managing our assets, products, information, and cash flow with the ultimate goal of maximizing supply chain surplus. Now, this is a very distinct example of how customer preferences and customer characteristics would determine this supply chain structure. Right, so this is a picture of some of the supermarkets and big congregated stores in the U.S. Right, so Costco, Sam's Club, Walmart. These are usually very, very big supermarkets located usually outside of the city proper, and usually as customers will drive to these stores to make big purchases. And in contrast, in India, or at least some part of India, right, you'll see these little grocery stores that is located in the city center, and they're much, much smaller, and people will go there more frequently and buy in small basket sizes. All right, so then in these two cases, the supply chain structure would be very different. So for example, for Walmart, the function of having a third-party distributor is very limited because of the scale of Walmart. It's already able to take advantage of economy of scale. Right, so it doesn't need to use another third-party logistic company to deliver its product for them. But in India, if we have a lot of small grocery shops dispersed in the area, then each delivery to these stores is very small size. Right? And then if each one has to make their own delivery, then it will be very expensive because you can only utilize a very small portion of the truck capacity. So then the role of a third-party logistic or third-party distributor is very important because then they can aggregate the orders from all of these grocery stores and make the logistic part much more cost efficient. So, and these are some other examples of, just to give you an idea in dollar value, what is the importance of supply chain decisions. So Walmart has designed its supply chain specifically with clusters of stores around distribution centers in order to facilitate frequent deliveries to its retail stores in a cost-efficient manner. And from 1980 to 2016, the sales jumped from 1 billion to 482 billion. So, and question. So why does Walmart want to build so much distribution centers close to their grocery store or supermarket locations? Yes.
It's more cost effective and it's cheaper because they will have frequent distributions and frequent visits to their stores from their suppliers, so it will be cheaper for them because the distance is shorter
Mm-hmm.
and less time to get the product to re-up their stock.
Yes. So cost efficiency is an important factor. What is another benefit of these frequent deliveries?
Depends on the product, but sometimes you have freshness of the product. You don't have to bulk up and end up with stock that you didn't use, that expired, that you don't have, so you can always re-up and have everything fresh.
Yes. So freshness is a small part of it, but you mentioned you may have less waste, right? So waste is what? Waste is too much inventory. And then, so basically, by being able to do these frequent deliveries, we can better match supply with demand. Right? Less over order and less under order. And 7-Eleven is another example of very successful supply chain management. So their supply chain is very, very responsive, along with a very an outstanding information system. And its responsiveness allows it to change the product mix on a daily or half-day basis. So then, in the same logic, it can also match demand exactly. Another example is, so Webvan. So how many of you have heard of Webvan? No one, right? Because this company went bankrupt. It was actually, after bankruptcy, it was folded into part of Amazon. But it was actually one of the pioneers of online grocery suppliers. So back in the days, you were able to order grocery from their website, and they built a bunch of distribution centers in the region to deliver grocery to customers' homes. So any guess why they went bankrupt?
Much logistical costs.
Too much cost. and deliver these grocery to end customers. Yes.
In the phase stage.
Yes.
Maybe they didn't have enough distribution centers around the distances from their distribution centers to the customers were too large to compensate what they're selling versus the cost to get them there.
Right. So yeah, so basically, you guys hit it on the head. It's the Webvan was able to turn its inventory a little bit faster than grocery stores, but the cost of delivering these items to satisfy somewhat irregular demand was just too high. And then there are examples of Borders, which was a brick and mortar bookstore, which also went bankrupt in 2010. Guess why they went bankrupt? So they were a brick and mortar store, only offering physical books, right? And then someone else entered the market, offering a different kind of selection of books, and which eventually led to its bankruptcy. Who is that player? Can you guess? Amazon. Yes. So that's an example of not anticipating the shift in customer purchasing behavior. So they basically started the change to digital forms way too late and way too little, and eventually, as a result, went bankrupt. And for Dell, as I mentioned, so they originally was offering direct supply chain, direct shipping of personal computers to its end customers, but in 2006 adopted new supply chain strategies to sell to retail companies such as Best Buy, because the customer preferences now shifted towards more standardized computer models. So to briefly summarize what we have learned so far, we talked about what is the objective of the supply chain, to maximize the supply chain surplus, which is the difference between customer valuation and the cost of supply chain. So, and to achieve this goal, we need to focus on coordinating members in the supply chain to increase the overall size of the pie rather than each company focusing on their own goals. And we also learned that supply chain decisions will have a large impact to determine the success and failure of each firm, because they can influence substantially the generated revenue and the cost. So in order to manage supply chains, we need to devise appropriate strategies to manage the flow of product, information, and cash. Now, in terms of types of decisions in supply chain, we can roughly categorize supply chain decision into 3 phases. One is the supply chain strategy and design phases, which are usually very long-term decisions spanning over several years, which will determine basically what is the overall structure of the supply chain. And in the intermediate term, we have the supply chain planning decisions, which basically is to operate under the overall supply chain strategy and set the overall policy for making supply chain, day-to-day supply chain operation decisions. And this is usually in a time frame of several months to a year. And finally, we have supply chain operations. So this is more of the day-to-day decisions that's faced by supply chain. And we'll discuss some of these decision phases in details. So the decisions in the supply chain strategy or design phase will determine the configuration of the supply chain. So what are the nodes in a supply chain, basically, and how they are connected to one another. And the allocation of resources and what processes each stage will perform. Specifically, these decisions involve whether to outsource each of the supply chain functions. So for example, do I outsource logistics to a third-party supplier, or do I do logistics myself? And then we have facility location decisions. So where do I build my plants? Where do I build my grocery stores? And how big should they be? So the capacities of these facilities. And then products to be made or stored at each of these locations. So which product is to be made at each production facility, and which products to sell at each retail facility. And then modes of transportation. So in terms of logistics, do I offer truck or do I offer air freight? And in terms of truck, do I offer full truckload or less than full truckload, and so on and so forth. And then the overall building of the information system has to be determined in the long run as well. So in general, supply chain design should support the strategic objectives. And because these are very long-term decisions and they're hard to reverse, usually when we make these decisions, we also need to account for market uncertainty. So in mathematical terms, these decisions are often made in stochastic models. And in a second category, so we have intermediate planning, where we basically define a set of policies. So these are the policies that we use to guide the short-term operational decisions. So when we make supply chain planning decisions, we already have some input given to us, which are fixed by the strategic phase. So we are given for example, where the facilities are, what their capacities are, and then our planning is based on these strategic decisions. And the goal, again, is to maximize supply chain surplus with established constraints given by strategic decisions. And it starts with forecasting of demand in the next quarter to next year. And so companies in the planning phase generally try to build in as much flexibility as possible into the design phase and exploit this flexibility to maximize the performance. So what are the typical planning decisions? One is demand allocation. Right, so in a strategic phase, if I'm Walmart, I've already built a number of grocery stores. Then in the planning phase, I'm going to decide which part of demand is going to be served by the store. And that will determine how much inventory I will hold overall, for example. So I also plan the build-up of inventories. So the general expected inventory level or any safety inventory level. And also inventory policies. So we'll see some of the inventory models. So whether I use, for example, some of you were in MSC 580 and you know QR policy, UQ policy, and so on and so forth. And then subcontracting, right? So, if I've already decided something was to be outsourced or done in-house, in the planning phase, you may also change this decision by creating subcontracting. And also for manufacturers and retailers, you might determine which times during the year I'm going to run promotions and markdowns. So in the planning phase, you also will incorporate demand uncertainty, incorporate exchange rates if this is an international company, and any competition over the planning horizon will be accounted for as well. So, and then on the most nitty-gritty level, we have supply chain operations. Usually these decisions are made weekly or on a daily basis. And on this level, we're looking at the decisions to be made regarding each individual customer orders. So a lot of times this is involving much less uncertainty. Sometimes this is already realized demand with no certainty at all. And we already have fixed decisions based on the previous two stages, having decided the supply chain configuration and the planning policies. So given that those constraints, how do we meet customer demand as efficiently, as effectively as possible? That's the decision to be made in supply chain operational stage. Some of the examples are how do we allocate inventory or production to individual orders? Right, so whose demand to satisfy first when there is not a sufficient inventory? And set a date by which orders need to be fulfilled. So set your production lead time, and then generate pick lists at the warehouse, allocating orders to trucks in a particular shipment, set delivery schedules and the number of trucks involved, and then place the actual placement of replenishment orders. So since the planning horizon is very short in operational decisions, we're facing much less uncertainty, and the decisions are generally expected to be very effective. So, brief summary of this module is that we learned about how to categorize supply chain decisions based on the planning horizon. Right, so we have the long-term decisions, that is supply chain strategy and design. And we have the intermediate term decisions, that is supply chain planning, and we have the short term decisions, that is operations. And so in each category, we talked about what are the common decisions to make and their corresponding time scale. Okay, so let's take a break first, and we'll continue after about 15 minutes. Let us continue. So supply chains are basically concatenations of different processes and flows that take place within and between different stages and different players in a supply chain. And so there are two general views to consider these processes. One is called the cycle view, and one is called the push versus pull view. So the cycle view basically look at the interactions between two consecutive stages within the supply chain as a single cycle. And each of these cycles will involve the customer placing an order and then receiving this order after the supplier has supplied the product. So depending on the structure of the supply chain, we may have the end customers placing an order to a retailer fulfilling this order and deliver to the customer. And then between the retailer and the distributor, the same cycle also applies. Right? The retailer will place an order to the distributor. The distributor will use a truck to deliver this order to the retailer. And same thing happens between distributor and manufacturer and supplier, supply with higher tier suppliers, and so on and so forth. So each cycle, the difference between these cycles on different places in the supply chain, one is the size of order. Right? So as we go, say, upstream the supply chain, what do you expect the size of order? How do you expect it to change? Increase, right? So because there are more and more aggregation. And then another difference is the predictability of orders. So orders, for example, in the procurement cycle is completely predictable once the manufacturing plan has been done. Right, so depending on the process adopted by the manufacturer, say if it's a make-to-stock system, and I'll explain make-to-stock in a little bit, then the manufacturer will say, okay, I'm going to produce this much in each month for the next quarter. So then once it determines that plan for the supplier, its demand has already been fixed. Right, so then there would be, it's very predictable demand for the supplier. And this cycle view is a predominant view that is applicable to the ERP system that is used by a lot of companies, and it's a transaction level view and clearly defines each process and its owner. So within the cycle view, in each cycle we'll also have these different sub-processes. Right, so they can be linked to the sourcing, making, delivering, and returning process. Okay, so we may have supplier stage the marketing this product, and then the buyer stage will decide whether or not to place an order. Then once the buyer places an order, the supplier will receive the order. Then what if it's able, then it will supply the order. Then the buyer will receive the supply, and they may also return the reverse flows to the supplier or some other third party. And so within each cycle, the goal of the buyer is to ensure the suppliers to ensure product availability and to achieve economy of scale in ordering. And the supplier also attempts to forecast the customer orders and reduce the cost of receiving an order. So, for example, let's take the process of customers buying a book from Amazon. You know, the interface between us and Amazon bookstore. Right. So, first stage, we'll have Amazon laying out its book inventory. So I have this book available, and really the information. So what this book is about and how long it takes to receive this book. And then if you like this book, you'll place an order. This order will be registered in Amazon's information system. And if they have a book in the inventory, it will initiate the fulfillment center order fulfillment process, which will be delivered, by FedEx, by UPS, or by Amazon fulfillment process to the buyer. Then, if it turns out you don't like the book, you may decide to return the book back to Amazon, or you decide to sell this book to another third party. Right, so this is the cycle view of supply chain process. The other view is push versus pull. So the push versus pull is basically the difference between make to order versus make to stock. Or make to stock versus make to order. So basically, the difference between push and pull is depending on the timing of the execution of these processes in relation to customer demand. What does that mean? So for pull process, this process is going to be initiated after a customer order is received. So it's in response to the actual customer order. Whereas the push process is initiated only in anticipation of the customer order. So basically, customer order is not yet realized, but I may have some belief based on my forecasting system that I'm going to receive however many orders. So then these processes generated by this forecast or anticipation is called a push process. Then between these processes, we have the so-called push and pull boundary. And usually in supply chains, we'll see push processes in the upstream of the supply chain and pull process in the downstream of the supply chain. In between, we have the boundary. And So the boundary is exactly the point where customer order is received. Right, so the pull process happens after order arrives, push process happens before order arrives. And the key difference, of course, is related to demand uncertainty. So since pull process happens after demand arrives, then in this part, the demand is known. Whereas in push process, the demand is unknown. Now, so in terms of demand uncertainty, we'll have zero demand uncertainty in the pull part and full demand uncertainty in the push part. And of course, even though demand is known in the pull process, it's still, sometimes we may still not able to respond perfectly to match demand because of the constraints created by the upstream processes. So to illustrate the difference between push and pull cycles, let's look at two examples. Both are furniture manufacturers, or furniture sellers. So one is this company called LL Bean. So LL Bean is a make-to stock seller. So you can imagine, if you're not familiar with LL Bean, imagine IKEA. Right, so you go to their furniture store, you look at their inventory, and you like something, you buy, you decide to buy something, and then you immediately get the product from their inventory. Right, so in this case, LL Bean is directly facing customer orders, and the only pull process happens after customer places an order, which is the last cycle. Right, so between customer and LL Bean. And then everything above is push process. So when the manufacturer makes furniture, they don't know how many customers are actually going to come. They build however many based on forecast. And a different furniture company, Ethan Allen. So Ethan Allen operates a different business model. Instead of a big furniture store / warehouse like IKEA, they operate showrooms. So as customers, you go to their showrooms, you look at the selections they carry, experience the products, and then you place an order with them, expecting having to wait for a period of time for the order to arrive. The upside of this is that you'll be able to customize some of your preferences into the furniture. You know, change the color, change the material, and so on and so forth. So then, so Ethan Allen is a make-to-order seller. The making process, the manufacturer's cycle, is combined with the customer order cycle into part of the pull process. Right, so customer order arrives initiates the manufacturing cycle. And then Ethan Allen does not operate make to stock for its component parts, meaning that customer order arrives after the components parts are ordered. Right, so the component part procurement cycle is part of the push process. Okay, so these are, we talked about different views of the supply chain processes, and what are the overall modules of supply chain macro processes. They can be classified into the part that's facing customer, the part that's within your company itself, and the part that's facing the supplier. The part that's facing the customer is categorized into customer relationship management module. Now, in the part that's within your company is internal supply chain management, and the part that's facing upstream of the supply chain with your suppliers is supplier relationship management. So, examples of customer relationship management, it involves the marketing of the product, pricing, the actual selling, the sales of the product, and then customer service. You know, you may have a call center, you may have a return center, and so on and so forth, and then the management of customer orders. Within the firm itself, we have the standardized supply chain planning and operations. So we have the strategic parts, we have the planning of demand, planning of supply, planning of how we fulfill demand, and any field service. Facing suppliers, we may deal with sourcing decisions, right, who to buy from, and negotiation between this firm and the supplier, and then the actual purchase orders. And sometimes in a more integrated supply chain, you may also decide to collaborate with suppliers on the actual design and the supply process. So in many firms, we'll have marketing department in charge of the customer relationship management module, and manufacturing handling the internal supply chain management, and then the purchasing department will oversee the supply relationship management part. But it's not unusual for these three departments to have different forecasts. So a lot of times they don't work very closely together, and as you can imagine, that brings negative impacts. So the lack of integration between these different departments may hurt the performance of the supply chain, and the ability to match supply and demand, leading to maybe customer unsatisfaction and a loss of supply chain profitability or high supply chain cost. So it's important to have good communication and collaboration between these different departments. So in summary, we talked about the cycle view of supply chain, breaking supply chains into cycles of directly interfacing parties. And then we talked about push versus pull view of the supply chain, which is distinguished by their relationship to customer order arrivals. And we also talked about the macro processes in the supply chain, customer relationship management, internal supply chain management, and supply relationship management. And the important note to pay attention to here is the different macro processes has to be integrated and coordinated between one another. All right, so then let's look at some actual examples of supply chains, in different scenarios, what people have done, and through these examples to look at some of the common decisions that's involved in supply chains. Okay, so in the book, it gives these 6 examples between Apple and Gateway, how they manage their inventory differently. Zara, which we'll look through. Toyota, how they determine the facility location, facility capacity planning decisions. And Amazon, with its online retail business. And then the difference between W.W. Grainer and McMaster Carr, which are 2 maintenance parts seller, and they differ in their way of fulfilling orders. And then finally Macy's, which we'll go through in detail. So first example is Zara. Right, so Zara, I'm assuming all of you are familiar with this, really one of the biggest fashion retailer. Right, so why is Zara so successful? It's because it has formed these really responsive supply chain. So before the age of Zara, the norm of apparel industry is to get their inventory every about 6 months. So, and then Zara entered and then changed the cycle time to about 4 to 6 weeks. And this will allow Zara to introduce new designs every week and change almost 75% of its product display every 3 to 4 weeks. And to customers, this is very attractive. So it gives a lot of selections, and they're also able to respond to customer preferences in a very agile way. And the result of this is that they are able to sell a lot of their product at full price, as opposed to many of their competitors who sell almost half of their inventory in markdowns and in the sales season. How do they achieve this? So they have a combination between flexible and quick sources in Europe and low-cost sources in Asia. So for products that has volatile demand, these products are sourced from Europe, which accounts for about 40% of the manufacturing capacity, which is directly owned by the mother company of Zara, Inditex. And the rest, 60%, is outsourced. So the products that are more standardized, white t-shirt, black pants, stuff like that, are outsourced to production in Asia, where the cost is much lower. And so this responsiveness, along with postponement decisions after trends are known, allows Zara to reduce their inventory and forecast error. They also invest heavily in information technology and make sure that the latest sales data are available to drive replenishment and production decisions. They also have a very tight connection between customer reviews, customer feedbacks, with their design team. So they're able to quickly update their designs to reflect the newest customer preferences. And then in 2012, they distributed to stores all over the world from 8 distribution centers located in Spain. And the group says their delivery time is about 24 to 36 hours for Europe stores and up to 48 hours for other stores. And the shipments from DC to stores are made several times a week. So by doing this, they allow inventory to closely match with customer demand. So the Zara supply chain is a very classic case in supply chain management about responsiveness of supply chain. Now, in looking at this case, what does Zara gain in against their competition by having the responsive supply chain? Yes.
If there's a change in trend or a new style comes out, they're quicker to respond and put out a new line of clothing before their competitors do.
Mm-hmm.
So they respond to the market much faster than
Right. Much faster response to markets to demand. Right. So basically, the reduced lead time reduces the uncertainty and reduce the time that they are allowed, or they are they have to respond to supply chain and demand trends. And so another prominent thing that they're doing is they have these 2 different types of manufacturing. One is they produce in-house in Europe, and then they also produce something else by outsourcing to manufacturers in Asia. So why do they maintain the Europe store while they are able to outsource at a cheaper price in Asia?
To keep up with the trend, latest
To keep up with the latest
trend,
trend,
latest customer demands.
because Europe is
Also, if they outsource to the US, it's closer from Spain to the US than it is from Asia to the
wait a minute.
US. When they send their products to America stores,
Mm-hmm.
if they're outsourcing from Asia, from Europe, it takes less time than they would from
Right.
Asia.
Right. So by having their manufacturing facility close to market, that also reduces response time and reduces supply lead time. And so, do you think Zara's responsive replenishment structure is better for online sales or brick and mortar stores?
Stores.
Stores? Why is that?
Lesser inventory.
Less inventory. Okay. Why is store inventory more important?
Because after a period of time, the trend in clothing changes. So facing high orders, and keeping the stock is less profitable.
Okay. Yes.
Also, having the online sales, you can have a full system versus having a store which is more of a push system, where I'm always putting both in the store, not knowing how much people are gonna buy there. Whereas online, I'm getting the order and then I'm
Good point.
then
So, faster response will allow us to do more pull than push. And we know that in pull, there is less uncertainty. So, this question has more complicated responses, and in this course, we're going to learn about some concepts that's going to affect, the relative attractiveness of the replenishment structure in online versus retail sales. And let's look at another short case. So we know Macy's is one of the biggest traditional brick and mortar retail stores, and in the past decade, it made a big push to omni-channel retailing. Omni-channel retailing means that it applies both direct sales channel and using its retail stores and an online channel. So in Macy's omni-channel, customers can browse online and go to the store to experience the products or order online after seeing a product at the store. And the orders placed on any channel could access the Macy's entire assortment. And if the customer desires, order placed online could also be picked up at select stores, and items purchased online could be also returned to stores. So there is a mesh between the online channel and the in-store channel. However, by 2015, this approach has seen some challenges. Another approach that's applied by W.W. Grainer is that 50% of the products and 30% of sales dollars were shipped to customers from Grainer, but in 2001, they changed their network design and decided to fulfill the online orders from distribution centers instead of retail stores. And the goal is to take advantage of picking and transportation efficiencies by aggregating online order fulfillments from DCs. So a question is, comparing to Macy's and WW Grainer's models, should online orders be fulfilled from distribution centers or retail stores? Yes.
Distribution centers, I noticed when Sears was going out of business, they kind of show you where you can get like a treadmill from, but it would say like New York. But how much would it cost to get it from a store in New York to ship it here was way more expensive than if they had a distribution center like somewhere in Ohio. They could probably get it to me a lot quicker.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So by building distribution centers, you can bring the inventory closer to the end customers. Given that the demand is uncertain and demand from different grocery stores or inventory from different grocery stores may run out. Right. Are there any drawbacks to fulfilling from distribution centers? Yes.
When comparing it to having them in store, I think one advantage that just comes to mind is I'm kind of deleting the fact that I have to transport this good because my customer is doing now that service for me, coming himself and picking it up from my store.
Mm-hmm.
So now my store is like doing a double function. It's both a store and a distribution center at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's for me one drawback from using a distribution center versus being the store. So my distribution center has one function and my store has a separate function.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I could combine them in both, might be more cost efficient to have the customer come pick up this product instead of me sending it out to him.
Mm-hmm. Interesting point. So the last mile delivery from either retail store or distribution center to customers could be very costly. And yes, more and more retailers have this mode of order something online and pick up in store. So that is a big money saver for these retailers. Whether customers are willing to do that is another question, right? So there is also inconvenience cost to be considered by asking customers to pick up in store. So there are all kinds of trade-offs between the proximity of inventory to customer, the uncertainty faced by stores versus distribution centers, and you may also consider the logistics of transporting the products from distribution centers to stores and stores to customers, and then customer preferences. So this question has no simple answer. Yes.
Also, another thing, if I have multiple stores across, let's say, the US, can't I use my stores as distribution centers between each other? So if someone is ordering, let's say, in Michigan, and the product is in Ohio, I don't have to send it to the customer, I can send it to my store, and then have the customer come pick it up from that nearby store.
Mm-hmm. So what you're talking about is transshipment between stores. Yes, that is also another practice that's used. In that case, there's the saving for sure of delivering the last mile to customer, but also there's also costs associated with transporting the goods from one store to another. So all part of the trade-off. So, and then when we talk about online retail and online businesses, there are other questions to be answered. You know, how should store inventory be managed in an omni-channel setting? Which part of inventory should be allocated to online order or in-store order? And also, when customers return their items, right, should they be kept in store or should they be sent back to the fulfillment center? So all of these are decisions to be made in each specific setting of supply chain. So, in summary, we talked about supply chain strategy. For example, how responsive do you want your supply chain to be? And we talked about facility location decisions. And we talked about capacity planning. There's channel design decision. Like, how do I manage multiple channels, or do I even offer multiple channels? And then when we do have optimal omni-channel retail, how do we fulfill demand and how do we allocate capacity? And in addition, we need to make production planning decisions at each facility, and we need to manage the inventory at each facility. So, this is sort of an advertisement for the book. Basically, the decision, the proposition of the book is to position various skills that's identified by employers to be most useful. And in this class, we're going to use different elements to touch on most of these elements. And you'll learn the theory, and you'll learn the models, you'll learn some tools to manage the supply chains, and you'll also discuss how to apply them into practical problem solving. And especially we'll make a link between analytical models and analytical decision tools with decision making. So we have a little time left. We'll discuss briefly a little bit of the start of chapter 2, and the most will be discussed in the next lecture. Now, in chapter 1, what we talked about is how do we define supply chain? What are the importance of supply chain design, planning, and operations to a firm's success? And we mentioned supply chain strategies and supply chain design decisions. So in this chapter, we're going to look at how to achieve the fit between supply chain strategies to supply chain decisions. And we're going to identify the main levers that deal with uncertainty in the supply chain and talk about the importance of expanding the scope of strategic fit across the supply chain. Now, we're going to talk about the relationship between competitiveness and the supply chain strategies. So, a competitive strategy basically defines the set of customer needs a company seek to satisfy through its products and services. And this is basically where and how this company is going to deliver value to customers. And in order to execute the company's competitive strategy, all functions of the supply chain also needs to play a role, and each of these functions must develop their own strategy accordingly. So, one example of competitive strategy, for example, for Walmart, is that it's aimed to provide high availability of a variety of products of reasonable quality at low prices. So the key is high availability and low price. Now, then the company needs to develop strategies related to product development, related to marketing and sales, and related to supply chain to go with the competitive strategy. So in product development, we specify the product portfolio. So what is the assortment of products that we're going to sell? So for Walmart, since what they're focusing on is product availability and low cost, they don't really differentiate on the assortment of products they sell. Most of the product they sell can be found in a lot of other retail stores. And then we have marketing and sales. So marketing and sales defines how markets should be segmented and how do we position, price, and promote our products within each market segment. So for Walmart, because its strategy is competitive strategy, it specifies it provides high variety, high availability, and low cost. Then for the pricing of the products, of course, it has to be very competitive. And its inventory and supply chain is structured in a way that product availability is usually very high. And how we can achieve that, we're going to discuss later on in the course. And supply chain strategy specifies what the operations, distribution, and service functions, whether they're performed in-house or outsourced, should do particularly well. And each of these functions should support one another and should be in agreement with the competitive strategy. So along the so-called value chain, so the components of a supply chain that creates value, we have product development, marketing and sales, operations, distribution, and service. And all these functional elements should have strategies that support one another and the competitive strategy. So, for example, 7-Eleven does a really good job in aligning the different strategies along the different parts of the value chain. The marketing part, 7-Eleven, what 7-Eleven emphasizes is convenience. Right, so easy access to stores and availability of a wide range of products and services. So for the new product development part, in order for it to be aligned with that, it's constantly developing new products, and the bill payment services that draw customers in and exploit the information and infrastructure, and the fact that customers are going to visit the stores very frequently. And then operations and distributions at 7-Eleven are focused on having a high density of stores in very close proximity to customer locations, being very responsive and providing very good infrastructure. So as a result, these different elements will reinforce each other and create a virtuous cycle. And we mentioned strategic fit. So what does strategic fit mean? So basically, given its competitive strategy, which parts of the company's supply chain should do particularly well? And consider, for example, if there is a company with its marketing department publicizing that the company is able to provide a large variety of products very quickly, just like what 7-Eleven does. And simultaneously, the distribution is targeting the lowest cost of transportation methods. Does that create any problems?
Can you repeat what are they doing with the transportation methods?
So the transportation methods is focused on identifying what is the cheapest option there.
No, they don't align. Because one is trying to get there the fastest to always have product availability. Looking for the cheapest way does not mean looking for the quickest way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So they don't necessarily align.
Right. Unfortunately, the cheapest mode of transportation usually mean slow and unreliable. Right. So that is in confliction with the company's marketing strategy, that we're able to provide products with very quickly and a very large variety very quickly. So the company lacking of strategic fit may fail because its overall supply chain design, processes, and resources do not provide the capability to support the desired strategy. And in the Dell's example, because of the different strategic fit or competitive strategies that Dell has between the eras prior to 2006 and year after 2007, they have structured their supply chain differently in order to support the different strategies. And so that each of the many types of the supply chains is designed to perform different tasks well. And a company must understand what its supply chain is designed to do well. The competitive strategy and functional strategies must be aligned and form a coordinated overall strategy. And different functions in the company also must work together and structure their processes and resources to execute these strategies successfully. And the design of the overall supply chain and the role of each stage should also be aligned to support the supply chain strategy. And overall, the strategy within the supply chain and within each component of the supply chain should be consistent with the customer needs or what the company competitive strategy specifies to be focusing on. So how do we achieve strategic fit? For one, we need to understand the customer and supply chain uncertainty, and we need to understand what is the capabilities of your supply chain, and then we can achieve strategic fit. So the first step is to understand what is the competitive strategy. So compare 7-Eleven versus Sam's Club. Where do you think they derive value? How are they different? They're both retail stores. Yes.
One is convenience, like you run out, like let's just say if you're a parent and you have a child in diapers, you can run out real quick and go to 7-Eleven. And one is like in bulk. So like if you're a parent that's trying to plan ahead, you probably have a closet full of diapers that you got from Sam's Club.
Right. So 7-Eleven is branding convenience, whereas Sam's Club is most likely branding cost efficiency. So, in achieving strategic fit, we need to understand the customers and supply chain uncertainty. So we need to understand the need of each customer segment and the uncertainty these different segments' needs impose on the supply chain. Now, these needs will help the companies to define the desired cost and the desired service requirements. And the supply chain uncertainty will help the company to define the extent of the unpredictability of demand and supply must be prepared for. So, in general, customers from different segments have different characteristics, and they may want have different preferences related to different aspects of the product. So, in one, if we look at the quantity of product needed for each lot or for each order, production order, and if we talk about the emergency order versus a regular product order, the quantity may vary a lot in emergency orders, and it may be very stable in regular usage scenarios. And in these scenarios, the response time that requires by the customer, of course, also is very different. Right? So in emergency requirements, we require the response time to be very fast. In regular sales scenarios, not so much. And in terms of the variety of products needed, the customer may place a high premium on the availability of all parts of an emergency repair order from a single supplier, but this may not be the case for a regular order. For emergency order, the service level requirement is usually very high, but if it's not an emergency order, sometimes customers are more willing to wait, and a lower service level is more tolerable. And in terms of the price of the product, the customer of an emergency order tend to be much less sensitive to price of the product than the customer of a regular product. And in terms of the desired rate of innovation in the product, customers at the high-end stores will likely demand more innovation than in in a lower-end department store. And customer, for example, at Walmart will be less sensitive to how new the product is. And so when we talk about demand uncertainty, there is demand uncertainty itself. So that's the overall uncertainty of customer demand for a product. And there is also implied demand uncertainty. So in different scenarios, with the same customer segments, we even could have different levels of implied demand uncertainty. So, for example, the emergency order versus regular order scenario, right? So the demand uncertainty in emergency orders may be very high, and demand uncertainty in regular orders may be lower. And demand uncertainty when you have a more tolerable lead time may be lower than if you require the order fulfillment lead time to be very quick. So in general, we can have varying customer needs having different impacts on the implied demand uncertainty. So, for example, if the range of quantity required by customer increase, that means there is more uncertainty in the demand. If the lead time decreases, there is also more uncertainty in demand because there's less reaction time. And when the variety of products increases, demand uncertainty also increase. When the required service level increases, when the rate of innovation increases, and when the number of channels that the product may sell through increases, all have a tendency to increase the implied demand uncertainty. And we have in terms of the level of implied demand uncertainty and other attributes in the supply chain. So if the low demand uncertainty implied is low, then usually this corresponds to a product with lower profit margin. And with high demand uncertainty, it usually corresponds to high profit margin. So you can think of the difference between innovative product versus regular product. And so a product that is very new, very innovative, usually have a higher profit margin than an old product. And of course, if there is lower demand uncertainty, that means forecast will be easier and forecast error would be smaller. And lower demand uncertainty also means that it will be easier to match supply and demand. And then since it's easier to match supply with demand, then there is a lower likelihood of stock overstock, and which will tend to reduce the likelihood of end of season markdowns. So the another element that has impact on uncertainty is the impact of supply source capability on supply uncertainty. So supply uncertainty is strongly affected by the frequency of supply process breakdowns. So the more frequent, the more uncertain the supply process is. The unpredictability of the supply process, the quality, the lower the quality of the supply process, the higher the supply uncertainty. And if the supply capacity is smaller, then there's also higher supply uncertainty. If we increase supply capacity flexibility, it means that we may have the capability to process or produce different types of products using the same facility, that tends to decrease supply chain uncertainty. And if the production process is in the process of evolving itself, then supply uncertainty is also tends to be high. All right, so let's stop here for today, and we'll catch the rest next class.